Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Progressive Policy Institute. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson. The United States has been racked by very public instances of gun violence and mass shootings recently. This has happened in Uvalde, Texas, Buffalo, New York, Tulsa, Oklahoma, and many other places, frankly. And there's been a lot of questions about what we can do to address these types of shootings, often motivated as hate crimes, both the policies we can use and what can realistically be accomplished given the politics. Here today to talk about some of the options we have in the wake of this violence is Representative Brad Schneider. He represents Illinois' 10th District, and he's the sponsor of the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act. And that's what we're here to talk about today. So, Representative Schneider, thank you for being here today.
Jeremiah, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
So there was a hearing actually today, before we recorded this, in the Senate, which at the moment has declined to pass a version of your bill, the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act. And it was about the threat of domestic terrorists and of white supremacists in the country. I guess with that in mind, the first thing we should do is just talk about the facts of what would your bill do? What are you aiming to accomplish with this bill? And why do you believe it's necessary at this moment in time?
Thanks. I think that's an important place to start is what the bill does and a little bit of the history of the bill. So with respect to the bill itself, the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, we introduced it the first time in 2017. It would create offices in each of the Department of Justice, Federal Bureau of Investigations, and Department of Homeland Security. These offices would have defined roles, responsibilities, but also be empowered to work with each other. It would require the offices to report to Congress twice a year so we can do our oversight. Also, to ensure that the resources of the offices are being devoted to what is perceived to be the greatest risk at any given time. And then ultimately understanding what we're doing to identify threats, to intercept those threats before they become events, and where appropriate, to pursue prosecutions and ultimately convictions of people who are seeking to do Americans harm and promoting and engaged in domestic terrorism. So that is the crux of the bill. It doesn't create a new statute. As I mentioned, we introduced it first 5 years ago in the 116th Congress. It did not move forward there, or in the 115th Congress, excuse me. We introduced it again in the 116th Congress. In that Congress in September of 2020, it got a hearing and then ultimately came to the floor in the House where it passed on a voice vote, support from both Republicans and Democrats. It was stalled then in the Senate, unfortunately. And after that, we immediately began thinking about how do we reintroduce it in this Congress, the 117th Congress. The idea was to do it in a bipartisan way. We did it with 3 Republicans, 3 other Democrats, and myself in January of 2021. The hope was that we would build broad support. And then, of course, January 6th happened and things became political. Our bill passed the House last month. It passed the House last month, though, on a very much party line vote. The only Republican to support it was Adam Kinzinger.
Do you think that there's a Republican fear of this kind of bill being used to, I guess, go after Republicans? And that's maybe they look at January 6th and they see that their base is a little bit closer to domestic terrorism than they're comfortable with. Do you think that that's a legitimate fear that they have, that this kind of office could be politicized?
That's a great question. And I think I'm going to split it a little bit. The argument is that this can be politicized and it can be used to go after one party or the other. I think the bottom line, however, is that many in the Republican Party realize that there are folks aligned with their party, not necessarily who identify as Republicans, maybe they do, but they are supportive of Republicans that are getting, as you said, very close to the line of domestic terrorism, if not crossing over that line. And what I have observed of many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle is a reluctance to call those people out.
One of the questions I have is what this would do that doesn't already exist, because I know that the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security, they already are looking at domestic terrorism. They're already aware of the threat that white supremacy poses to America, and they've listed white supremacy as one of the main threats to America, and they've done reports on this. They have big teams of people working on it. So how does this make anything different if these agencies are already targeting white supremacists and other domestic terrorism?
Yeah, I think at the moment, these agencies know that their job is to protect Americans, and that therefore, in a piecemeal fashion, they are doing what they can to identify threats. What our legislation would do would create a more structured approach, establishing these offices in each of the three agencies, empowering them to work together and requiring them to report to Congress twice a year, would create a more focused approach to identifying and stopping threats, and would also, I think, help ensure that Congress is aware of the threats that we face and is marshaling and allocating the necessary resources to stop these threats and keep people safe.
The politics here are honestly a little bit interesting, because when you think about bills that kind of enhance the security state, I typically think of the Patriot Act, and I know there have been comparisons made by some to the Patriot Act with this legislation, and we can get into whether or not that's fair or not. But when the Patriot Act passed, it was by a Republican president, and it had majority Republican support. And after it sort of became more unpopular and politically toxic at some point, it was mostly Democrats leading the charge against it. Not entirely, but mostly. And now you see this reversal where mostly Republicans are leading the charge against this legislation and mostly Democrats are supporting it. Although there have been some instances of Democrats who have concerns about this kind of thing, about, is this going to be Patriot Act 2.0? Do you really think it's just a naked political calculation here as for why the party's views have switched?
Let me first talk about some of the differences from the Patriot Act. Patriot Act came to being in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, a horrific attack on the United States, with the country looking to take swift action to respond to the attack, but also to keep the country safe. And it was done very quickly. And over the years since, work has been done to address some of the shortcomings of that. This bill, on the other hand, the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, we have seen increasing incidents of domestic terrorism for more than a decade. As you mentioned, the FBI, in particular, FBI Director Christopher Wray, has come to Congress and said the number one domestic threat he sees is from domestic violent extremists, in particular, racially motivated violent extremists. And so we've seen a growing need to respond to threats of domestic terrorism. At the same time, this bill has been crafted, and we've built a broad coalition. I noted that 2 years ago, the bill passed with a voice vote, Republican and Democratic support in the House. We have supportive groups like the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, religious groups, the Anti-Defamation League, various Muslim groups, groups that are focused on protecting LGBTQ community, the NAACP, Legal Defense and Education Fund. The list goes on. So we've built a broad coalition. We've worked very hard to make sure that we're addressing the specific challenges we face, as well as making sure that we're protecting individual freedoms and First Amendment rights. And that's why we have this broad support. And I keep coming back to the idea that a bill that passed on a voice vote with bipartisan support less than 2 years ago would be a virtually wholly partisan exercise today has to be because of the politics in what we're seeing on the far right, where they are getting concerningly close with groups that are at the best promoting actions that could be deemed as terrorism.
Can you give a little more detail about some of the things that you did to kind of install safeguards? Because if the Patriot Act comparison is unfair, as the Democratic Party and you probably would say it is, because every Democrat voted for this, I know that there were some concerns among certain Democrats and among certain interest groups about potential abuses. what did you do, and kind of what kind of safeguards or changes did you make to kind of make sure that everyone was on board? Because this was a party line vote, and every single Democrat did vote for it in the end, even the members who might be a little further left than you, even the members who would be Muslim or, be concerned about civil liberties. In the end, every Democrat voted for it. So how did you get everyone on the same team?
So the short answer is you work and build coalitions, you listen to people and try to address their specific concerns rather than allowing people to take political sides, and it becomes a partisan tug of war. We've listened to people from all perspectives, people on the left, people on the right, trying to make sure concerns about domestic terrorism isn't a party issue. The people who are attacking, whether it is in Buffalo, as you mentioned at the open, where someone went into a grocery store and specifically targeted that grocery store because it was in the African-American community, or someone goes into a store in El Paso, Texas, specifically looking to target immigrants and people in the Hispanic Latino community. It's a concern for all Americans. And I think the way you build a coalition for anything is draw to people's attention what the challenge is, find that common ground, and then show how what we're proposing here addresses those concerns. And what we're proposing here specifically addresses the concerns of identifying threats and stopping them before they become incidents, but also ensuring that you have the congressional oversight, requiring the three agencies to report to Congress twice a year to report what they're doing, what they're seeing, and Congress to exercise its oversight responsibilities, ensuring that the resources are being applied to where the greatest risks exist.
Now, in the wake of the recent spate of mass shootings, which, look, America has a lot of mass shootings. This happens every year, but the last couple of weeks have been especially rough. And there have been renewed calls, not just for this legislation, but for gun control. There are gun control measures that are making their way through the House. Many different things have been proposed. The Senate is also working to see if they can find some piece of legislation that can get through the 60 vote threshold there. In your mind, are these related issues? Are these related policies, or are they kind of separate?
I think they're separate, but they certainly have overlap. We're seeing a serious, grave epidemic of gun violence in our country. We talked about the mass shootings. Just since the Uvalde shooting 2 weeks ago today, we've seen at least 30 mass shootings in the country since then. We've seen, I think it's approaching 250 mass shootings this year. We are seeing kids being shot on the way to school or playing in a park. We're seeing people being gunned down, going about their everyday business. We have a problem with gun violence in this country. I think you can split to three categories. One is the efforts we're taking on gun safety, ways to help ensure that people are keeping their guns safe when they're in their homes, ways to ensure that people who shouldn't be allowed to buy a gun can't buy a gun with universal background checks, making it more difficult for those people to get weapons that will put the community at risk. There are things we can do to reduce gun violence. Background checks are certainly a part of that, but so are the investments we're making in communities. I was at an event last week in my district, a city called Waukegan, where we announced a gun violence reduction initiative, introducing what are called interrupters, people in the community who are trained to identify where there are conflicts and try to intercede or cool down those conflicts before they rise to the level of gun violence. Lots of things we can do to reduce gun violence. And then you get into the issues of dealing with some of these guns that we're seeing. And the idea of limiting large capacity magazines or limiting access to bump stocks are ways to not necessarily end shootings, but reduce the carnage that is created when someone walks into a movie theater, a grocery store, an elementary school with a gun that can fire off 100 rounds in a minute without reloading. These are things that all together can move us forward to reduce gun violence.
And I know that, you're a Chicago guy, and Chicago is an amazing city. and there's so many good things to say about it, but it also has struggled with gun violence for a long time. And it's part of being from Chicago is to understand how big of a problem that is. One thought that I see going around in center left circles or in policy wonk circles maybe is that mass shootings, while tragic, sometimes take the spotlight from the more regular, steady drip of shootings where it's like one person is killed with a handgun, one person is killed with a handgun. And that, like, something like 80 to 90% of all deaths from guns are either suicides or I hate to say, but like your quote unquote regular homicides. And so I guess that leads me into a question about, given the kind of steady drip of more regular homicide with gun, what measures would actually be, in your mind, the most impactful? If we could pass them, what would actually do the most to really reduce gun violence?
Yeah, Jeremiah, you're so right about this. First of all, if you lose someone to gun violence, there's no, it doesn't matter whether it was a mass shooting or was a accidental shooting that someone had a gun in their home that wasn't safely stored. It's a wound to the family that is never healed. I'm named for my mother's uncle who was murdered in 1943. And if you talk to my aunts and uncles about their uncle who was murdered, they talk about it in the present tense, not in the past. It's still there today. And I think about the families of the 10 people murdered in Buffalo in that grocery store. They will never recover. It's no different from a personal experience. If it's your child who was killed in a shooting in an alley in Chicago, we had a incident of exchange fire, gang fire, where a 14-year-old boy was killed in one of the towns in my district. And all of these are tearing our country apart, and we have to come up with ways to address each of them, understanding their differences. And you mentioned suicide. 2/3 of all gun deaths are deaths by suicide. So there's no single solution, but the fact that this is a complex issue, that the solutions are going to be very difficult, doesn't excuse us from not trying to come up with solutions. So we have to, things like background checks that will make it harder for people, whether they are a domestic terrorist, a gang member, or someone with a history of suicide ideations. Making it harder for those people to get guns makes them safer and our community safer along the way. And the House has passed multiple times. We passed H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act, to make it harder for someone to buy a large capacity magazine or buy massive quantities of ammunition without at least a yellow flag being raised and saying, I know this person doesn't hunt or go to do target practice. Why is he or she doing all of this? We can take those steps to try to make our community safer and ease some of the anxiety that literally everyone of all ages are suffering from in this country right now, whether it's worried about going to school, going to the grocery store, or going to visit a hospital.
If you had to call out one specific thing, would background checks be the thing that you think could really have that instant impact? Because again, obviously, there's no single policy that can act as the magic wand here. But is that one you think would be especially high impact compared to some of the other stuff, like, say, banning assault weapons or something like that?
Yeah, certainly, background checks can make a difference. Again, trying to make it harder for someone who shouldn't have a gun to get a gun, at the very least, makes intuitive sense, but we can also apply data to it. We know that has an effect. I would say raising the age to 21 for someone buying a military assault weapon. Again, looking at the data, the number of incidents, especially these mass shootings in our schools. I think the median age for the shooters in these instances is 20 years old. If those people had a harder time getting the assault weapon that they use in these incidents, would it at the very least make it the events less deadly than they are? I think that's something that we can do. That certainly will have an impact. I think what we need to do is find ways to come together. It has to be something that is reached across the aisle. gun violence takes different forms in urban communities versus rural communities, but the threat of gun violence, the concerns that all of these communities have is common, and we need to come up with some ideas for common solutions that will protect us all.
When you talk about reaching across the aisle, probably the most important place to talk about that is the Senate. If it was just up to the House, this would have passed a long time ago. And also your Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act would have passed. But the Senate is so often the graveyard of bills that end up that start in the House and pass. And right now there is an effort in the Senate, kind of these silent negotiations behind doors on red flag laws. Are you optimistic that the Senate will be able to reach something? I know you're not a Senate guy, you're a longtime House guy, but just as someone who's seen this, dog and pony show before, who's seen the dance, do you think that this time might be different, that we might be able to come to some sort of compromise?
Sure, and it's hard not to be cynical, having been in the House for a long time. I know that we have more than 600 bills that have passed the House on a whole variety of subjects, many that are presumably important to senators that are sitting in the Senate and just not moving because of their rules and the need to get 60 votes. But I think we are seeing a modest change in the rhetoric coming from the Senate, and that there may be an opportunity to make some steps forward. I am an optimist, so I will always be an optimist and say, let's keep working until we find a path through. It may not be our original path to get where we're going, but as long as we know what we're trying to achieve, we can find other ways to get there. I also believe that we need to focus on progress, not perfection. Whether it's trying to reduce gun violence or any other issue you can think of, I can say with confidence that the Senate's not going to see it the same way as the House. But if we can make steps forward and then work to build on those steps, assessing whether or not they have a positive impact, when they do have a positive impact, recognizing that, and then working to build on those successes, we can make steps forward well into the future. At the end of the day, what we're trying to do is keep our kids and our communities safe.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine how it must feel sometimes, like Sisyphus rolling the ball up the hill, or to use a slightly more modern analogy, like Charlie Brown, trying to kick that football and Lucy just keeps jerking it away. But I'd love to dive just a little bit deeper on the psychology of that, because there are people who are just sick and tired of this, and they've seen this so many times, and they feel like nothing's going to be done. There are people out there who care about this a lot, but are deeply cynical, and they're discouraged by the dynamic of something might happen in the House but get shot down, or it might be pass the House and then die in the Senate, and they're tired of getting their hopes up. So I guess as a two-part question, do you ever feel like Charlie Brown, running up to the football, and what would you suggest to people who do feel that sense of kind of despair at anything ever happening here?
Right. No, I appreciate that. I love Charlie Brown. And there are times I feel like him. I think it's a good thought. Charlie Brown, you just know Lucy's going to pull that ball out the next time. But I think there's a difference, and actually Sisyphus might be the better comparison. The story of Sisyphus is condemned forever to push that rock up the hill, only to have it fall down again. And especially when you talk about gun violence, we don't get to back away from this fight. We have to keep working to get the rock over the hill, to make our communities safer, to reduce the number of these mass shootings and shootings in our schoolyards, and the fear of kids and gang violence. You can run down the list, suicides. We don't get to give up. We have to keep working and trying. As I said before, there's never one path to any problem, to the solution to any problem. We have to keep looking for paths and trying to make whatever progress we can. It's not that there's someone pulling the ball out from us each time. It's that this is really hard, and that doesn't make it okay for us to give up. It just means we have to keep working harder and looking for new ways.
All right. Well, we're coming up on time because I know you have a busy schedule, and we're very thankful you could come here today. So I'll close with our traditional final question, which is, what should people do if they want to learn more? And I'll kind of ask this in two parts. This can be Number one, what should they do if they want to learn about the threat that domestic terrorism poses, about the facts of gun violence in America? What would you recommend? Or is there anything to read or any reports or any documentaries, anything like that you would recommend that really will clue people in here? And then the second part is, what can people do? Again, if they're motivated, if they care about this issue, if they hear this conversation and they want to go out and try to make something happen, what would you recommend that they do politically to organize or to take action around this?
Great questions. And learning has to be a part of this process. There's a lot of organizations that are tracking domestic terrorism, working to find ways to reduce the threat, starting with and including our own government. So reading some of the reports coming out of the FBI, what Christopher Wray is talking about. There's nonprofit groups or think tanks, whether it is Brookings Institution or Southern Poverty Law Center, ADL, all have folks devoted to trying to understand and identify risk and come in with ideas of how we might address that. So staying engaged, learning more, talking to people. There are folks that, depending where people live, at local universities who are thinking about this as well and are trying to come up with solutions. As far as to do, the first thing I tell everybody is don't give up hope. So keep the faith. We are a smart country, and we can find ways to tackle just about any challenge, whether it's landing someone on the moon or the progress we've made on dealing with diseases like cancer. It's not easy, and it's sometimes the job's far away from finished, but we have to keep working on it. Dealing with gun violence is a problem that we will continue to work on for a long time ahead, but we have to keep working together and working to find solutions. Domestic terrorism and the threats, it's a growing threat. It's not a shrinking threat. And so the more we stay engaged, the more we talk to our colleagues and our neighbors and bring politics back into the public square in a civil way, as opposed to the polarization that we have so much of in our country right now, I think the better off we'll be.
I certainly hope so. And nobody really wants this outcome that we've landed on, with the high levels of violence, higher than virtually in any other rich country. But it's where we are, and nobody desires that to be the case. And it's just, very frustrating for a lot of people that we're not able to take action faster, but hopefully we will be able to soon. So, Representative Schneider, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.